Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Tree Planners podcast. My name is Adam, and I'm joined, as always, as usual, by Margaret. Margaret, I got to get you familiarized with this platform, so then we can switch off, and I can take some breaks every once in a while.
Or we can just keep it the way it is.
Yeah,
and me too.
and we're thrilled to be joined by Kathleen Wynne today, former Premier of Ontario.
Mm-hmm. Morning, everybody.
And also, I should say, well, I'll leave that for another time. But
you've made us curious.
Yeah, I know. Now, what is he trying to say? I'm trying to be the Adam interpreter here.
No. So it was actually really boring and mundane. That countdown timer that I have on the opening scene, you have to start it manually, and I always forget. And so it was stuck at like 59 for 30 seconds. And, smooth professional operators here that we are. That's the way it goes. Anyways, so not exciting stuff. But, yeah. So we've got you for the better part of an hour, Kathleen.
Mm-hmm. We're hoping to talk to you today kind of about your local grassroots background. Mm-hmm. And you and I, you sit on the board at SCGC, and you and I kind of knew each other back in your premier days, not very well, but we had our run-ins with local politics.
Yeah.
Sorry?
Our paths crossed.
Our paths crossed a couple of times, for sure. So maybe if you want to enlighten people a little bit about how you got started, just even in the political world, because from my understanding, talking to you, it kind of came later in your life.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting when people ask me that question, and I think about how I began formally in politics. That's one story, but I think all of our stories go back farther than that. If I think about how I was raised, my mom was an agitator from the time I was little. She was always pushing against the boundaries and trying to make change. So I grew up in the 60s. I was born in 1953. I had a sister who was quite learning disabled, and my mom was always looking for supports for her. And then she transitioned from being a staying-at-home mom, and before that a singer, and she transitioned into being a community activist, where she and my dad started a drop-in center for young people during the 60s in Richmond Hill. I grew up in Richmond Hill, and she worked with a group of disabled young people who were living in a seniors like a long-term care facility. And she worked with them and helped them sing, and they became a musical group that toured the province called the Villatones. So she was always trying to make things happen and protesting things that were happening in the town. So I think I learned early on that if there's a challenge or a problem, that I had a responsibility to be part of looking for a solution. And that's really what, to my mind, that's what social activism and politics are about, is finding solutions to problems. And so I always tell people that my earliest act of political action was in 1966, 67, when I started high school. Girls weren't allowed to wear pants. And so we launched a protest, and we were sent home from school because we were wearing pants, and we got notes from our moms and came back and went back and forth. And finally the school and the board changed the rules. So that's all to say that I think the seeds of the politician were planted early. I think my personality was such that I was interested in interacting with people, but I got formally involved as a parent activist. First, I ran for school trustee in 1994. And then when Mike Harris was elected I lost that election in 94. And then when Mike Harris was elected in 1995, I was involved full-blown activism in reaction to his policies, because I felt very strongly that his Conservative government in Ontario was really undermining the social contract that had been in place since I was a kid, through the Bill Davis years, through the David Peterson years, that Mike Harris really undermined our education system, um, our environmental protection, um, our healthcare system, and also the relationship between municipal government and the provincial government. That changed. So that's when I got involved as an activist, and then ran for office again.
Were you always aware of that seed being planted? Because I'm just reflecting, and I know Adam probably has his own reflections on it, but reflecting on my own life a little bit, there's certain things that I remember my parents, like my dad, when I was like 3 or 4, would say, "What do you think of the political situation in Canada, Margaret?" I was always expected to have an answer.
Yeah.
I remember the first times, I don't even really remember understanding the question, like what. But it wasn't until I started to get active where I was like, oh, like I was kind of shaped in this way for a really long time. I guess I sort of attribute it to being my own personality versus feeling like, oh, those were earlier learning experiences, whereas an expectation. So were you always aware of the influence that you had with your parents, or was it something that you just kind of took on as your own?
Well, I don't think I would have framed it as being aware of my kind of nascent political consciousness. I don't think you think about that as a kid, but I was aware that there were always contentious conversations at our dinner table. And my dad was a family doc in Richmond Hill, and he would come home at lunch, and we had an hour and a half for lunch when we were kids, so we'd all be there around the table, and there were always issues to be discussed. I mean, I remember Dad talking about all the farmland being developed in Richmond Hill and railing about the developers, and my mom and dad challenging the local politicians about what was being done and how the decisions were being made. And then he served on the Ontario Medical Association, and as I said, Mom was doing this work in the community. So I was always very aware of that, being that politics was important. We talked about politics during the civil rights movement. We were very aware. My mom had been born in Nassau, so I had a kind of heightened awareness of the relationship between Black and white people, and because she talked about it a lot. And so Martin Luther King's death and JFK's death, I mean, those were really, really big issues in our family. I can remember the day that JFK was shot. I was in grade 6, and I can remember the class stopping and knowing that my parents were going to be devastated when I went home. So I was aware that the political discussion that went on in our family was not the same as the political discussion that went on in a lot of the families of friends of mine, if it happened at all. So that was certainly part of my beginnings.
Yeah.
I wonder, you kind of hint at it a little bit there. So the distinction between the kinds of discussions that you were having around the dinner table or in your family and what others might be. And that's always something that I wonder about. And I think as people who are quite engaged in political processes and things like that, this is often a question that's at the fore. So how to get other people involved and engaged. And it always seems like an uphill battle. And one of the things I often wonder about that is because so many people are just doing, like, their life is so full of just getting by. And I mean, you can attach the maybe, keeping up with the Joneses as part of that hamster wheel thing where we're all where so many of us are conditioned to always want more in our kind of consumer culture. But I'm just wondering how you think about that. Like, what kind of space perhaps is important to facilitating greater engagement in the political process? Is it something that's afforded to us as citizens? Is it something that you kind of have to fight for? Is it a privilege thing?
Yeah, so I have a lot of thoughts about that. I mean, I think that your first point about people just trying to get by. People's lives are full, and I think that's always been the case. I always say to people in organizations that, when people get agitated about there's such a small number of people who are involved, and why isn't everybody involved? Every single organization I've ever been involved in, that's been the case, right? And when you think about it, there are only 124 members of provincial parliament, out of 14.5 million people. So it's a small number of people who choose to be that engaged. And I think we can't expect that everybody's going to have the same degree of interest in a broad spectrum of issues. But I think that we need to, all of us in our lives, find allies and find these conversations where people are. Now, one of the things I worry about is that the number of places for those conversations has been reduced over time. So in my life growing up, we went to church, there were community gatherings, there were places where people gathered and face-to-face had conversations, but there still are. I mean, there are kids' sports events. There are, there are gatherings in the community, not maybe as many as there used to be. I think we've lost some town squares, but I think we need to be a bit braver about having some of those conversations in unexpected places and raising issues where we wouldn't necessarily expect them, not in an aggressive way, but engaging people where they are and sharing the opportunity to have a different kind of conversation. Now, that's not always easy. But if we decide as a society that we're not going to have these conversations, which I think in some cases we have, and we retreat to our social media or to our echo chambers, and we just talk to people who agree with us, then we're in big trouble. So I think we need to find people where they are and try to have some of those conversations. And we need to, where we can, and I think SCGC tries to do this, create spaces for people to have some of the difficult conversations. Right now, and I know we'll get into this, but right now it's almost as though we have given up talking about climate change, and we've kind of thrown up our hands and said, we're just going to have fires and we're not going to, floods, and we're not able to do anything about this. And I think that kind of thinking is so defeatist and depressing for people, and that it's just not true. There are things we can do, and we need to help each other to find those things. So it's a long-winded answer, but I don't think we can give up, Adam. I think it's maybe tougher than it was, but people still want to know what other people think. Like, that is a given. And so we need to find ways to provide opportunities for that.
Mm-hmm. I think you're making me think a lot about different resources and experience that I've had, and thinking to Adam's point, and also bringing in what you said earlier about those difficult conversations or those important conversations you have in the home, that you're having a conversation about what's happening in politics. And what studies show is that people are more likely to vote if their parents voted, if it became a thing where they talked about it. And, I hear people say, well, you don't talk about religion and you don't talk about politics because that's being impolite. And I'm thinking, well, at the end of the day, I remember my dad and my parents, maybe just because my family were debating kind of people, but I remember them having conversations with friends or people that were staying at our resort, because that's I was raised in a resort, about politics, American politics, about what was happening locally. That was kind of the thing that people were going to be talking about. Now it feels like we've gone to this polite conversation, which is rather shallow. In order to build some sort of bonds. But there's a book that I'm reading called The Power of Discord. And it's actually talking about how relationships thrive and are built on discord, that you need to kind of get to these bumpy conversations in order to not only develop your own communication skills, but to develop some cohesive bonds where you can get, because it's the repair that matters, not the actual discord. And Absolutely. So it seems like people are wanting to choose polite conversation because maybe they don't know how to actually repair it, or what are they going to say to say the wrong thing, versus like, let's work through some of these difficult conversations. So it would be, talking to some of my extended family, they don't vote, they don't talk about politics, they don't care to be involved in it. And I'm like, oh my gosh, people, like, it has to somehow start at the root of the people that having those difficult conversations. But anyways,
So
yeah.
Well, I think this is such an important point, the rooting of change and understanding in discord. So for a decade before I got into politics, I was working as a community mediator. So I was working in organizations, helping them mediate conflicts. I did some family mediation, but I was a community mediator. I'm not a lawyer, but I did, there are organizations and people who get into challenges and they need somebody to help facilitate a conversation. And a lot of the work I did was in schools, teaching, working with teachers, helping them deal with conflict resolution, and training kids to resolve issues. It was an imperfect process, but at the base of that work is the belief that it's actually in conflict that we build relationship and that we come to understand each other, and not being afraid of conflict. So that's the first thing. And I think it was incredibly helpful, because I was somebody who spent a lot of time getting into conflict and creating conflict, because I was opinionated and kind of unpleasant sometimes. But that's what propelled me, once I had children, into getting into this work, because I needed to understand it better, and it helped me in politics for sure. And the second little piece I want to say is that I just had a conversation with a newly elected MP, and the MPs now are dealing with lots of challenges around difficult conversations, particularly on issues in the Middle East. And politicians can go one of two ways. You can retreat and kind of barricade your door and try not to have those discussions, and play it safe in terms of, and I'm not being judgmental there, I'm just saying, keep your staff safe, and you have to do that. Or you can try to find a way to open your door and figure out how to have the conversation in the community. I said to some of the staff of this MP, I said, if somebody's got a battering ram and they're coming at your door, if you open the door, that battering ram is no longer a weapon, but if you shut your door and lock it, then it becomes more of a weapon. So I think that point you're making, Margaret, about the importance of discord and conflict, we've become very afraid of disagreeing with one another, because we're in such a polarized society, and because we're seeing what's happening in the States, and we've lost, I think, some of the ability to have a nuanced conversation about a lot of issues, whether it's LGBTQ, particularly trans issues, or whether it's the Middle East, or whether it's climate change. We are shying away from those to the detriment of our ability to solve problems.
It strikes me that there's like, so you also like noted the increased polarization, which is that discord component, but then there's the next step that Margaret mentioned, which is the repairing process of that, and how you kind of find compromise isn't quite the right, because it kind of,
it's understanding, I think, Adam, more than compromise. I think it's how can I get a better understanding of where you are coming from. My only problem with the shutting off of the discussion with the convoy in Ottawa, with whom I had no sympathy, and I think were hugely problematic what they were doing, but we didn't really get to the bottom of what was going on there. And I think we still don't really understand, we as a society don't really understand where those divisions are coming from in a real way. Yes, I know that there are economic issues and cost of living and all of that, but the visceral anger that is being displayed, particularly by a certain population of men, I will say, I don't think we understand well what's at the root of that, and I don't think we're working very hard to try to figure it out. We're still vilifying each other, and that's a huge problem.
It's too simplistic to say this is it, but I think it's a big part of it, which is that a lot of these people also are kind of very online people. They're very engaged in these different forums and things like that they use to communicate and organize with each other. And that, for me, it's a hobby horse. And Margaret's gonna just yawn when I bring it up, but social media. Because it is like it provides that space for discord and to sort of like say something against someone else or someone else's idea or whatever, and often in quite a provocative or antagonistic way. But then it doesn't have that follow-up step of reproachment of the repair of that, or return, and all those R's there, REs. But instead, it's just this like, you make your claim or your statement and then you walk off, and that's the end of it. And you're walking off into your own sort of, into your confirmation bias bubble area thing, right? And that process being repeated continually through these new modes of communication that we have is, for me, I think, really driving a lot of that antagonism and polarization and lack of understanding, as you say, like that component that really underlies the social contract that we have as a society, and is so crucial.
Yeah. So, and all of that leads to what I think we are seeing, which is, as part of the anti-woke, and I use air quotes to frame that, backlash against anti-racism work, against anti-homophobia work, all the kind of progressive, I will say, progressive work that has been done over the course of my lifetime in the last 50, 60 years to include more people. We are moving to exclusion again, so there's an increased permission for misogyny, increased permission for racism and homophobia and transphobia. And I think that makes this moment really, really important for those of us who think that that's the wrong direction, to stand up and say, this is what I'm seeing. I do a spot on a right-wing talk radio station once a week because I think it's important for different voices to be heard in unexpected places. And so, it's not where I thought at the age of 72 we would be. If you'd asked me in 1971 when I graduated from high school, how are we going to be doing in terms of an inclusive society, I would have said, we're on the right track. We're going to be doing pretty well. And I would say we are stepping backwards quickly right now. And so, again, that makes it even more important for those of us who have concerns about the environment and inclusion and compassion, that we step up and we not give up. I think that's the moment that we're in right now.
I have a sorry, I'll be real quick, Margaret, and it's just I've had this idea for a long time. I want to do a T-shirt or poster or something like that, which is a play on the anti-woke, and instead it's an auntie-woke, and it has like imagery of like strong women throughout history who've stood up for rights and things like that.
Yeah.
I was just thinking about the framing that I've been kind of toying with the last little bit about how we're regressing. And I wonder if it's not necessarily, there is some regression obviously with rights. Don't get me wrong, but I wonder if it's because the original movements weren't entirely whole. Do you know what I mean? Feminism was rooted mostly for white women, not as much for women of color. Indigenous rights were kind of left out of it. I wonder if this is kind of our way to make those environmentalism again was more based on white privilege than other things. I wonder if a different framing is, this is our chance to make it more whole, to make it more intersectional in a way that we need other allies, that maybe not to criticize the work that's been done, but maybe just an opportunity to expand the work and to make it deeper versus faster, stronger, linear. Does that make sense? Am I making sense?
Well, I think I think that's a generous and optimistic interpretation of the moment. But I think it's an important one, because what I hear you saying is that there's an opportunity in this moment. I don't think that's necessarily what's happening, but I think it's what we could make happen. I guess that's what I would
Yeah,
say.
yeah. I don't mean to pinpoint this is the reason why we're in this situation, but more of this is what this situation lends for an opportunity for us, right?
I agree. I agree.
And I
Yes.
think your point about the convoy, uh, is one of those things where we immediately decide this person has a valid point, this person has an invalid point, this person is educated, this person's uneducated, and it's all just put into these binaries about whether or not I should listen to you. And I was having a conversation with a local politician the other day, and he said to me, he said, the funny thing about you is that at least I always know what you're going to say. And I was like, well, I don't even know what I'm going to say all the time. He says, well, I always know that you're just going to say what you think the right thing to say is versus trying to figure out what the thing I want to hear is. I'm like, well, what's the point of me telling you things that I think you want to hear if that's not actually, what's going to help us understand each other, because that way you have a consistency. And he's like, yeah, but most people tend to just say what they think the other person wants to hear. So going back into these comfortable conversations, but then bringing that into the political sphere of, maybe we just need to be the yes people. Maybe we just need to kind of quash the conflict. Maybe we just need to follow the leader and hold the tail in front of you has made, in my view, with some of the politicians that I interact with, very gutless in some ways.
Well, and I think that statement from that politician says a lot more about them than it does about you, because that suggests to me that politician spends his or her life doing that, trying to figure out how to say the thing that the person wants to hear, which is completely counterproductive to your point. What is the point of that conversation? Of course, you mold what you're saying to the situation so that the person you're talking to can hear you, but to just say what what you think they want them. First of all, you can often make a mistake in that, right?
Sure.
And so, I think it's always better to say what you think. But anyway, I think that says more about the person than it does about you. And I think you're right that that lack of courage has kind of become endemic, and holding on to power is more important than actually having a difficult conversation. And I think that takes us right down the wrong path.
Well, yeah, clearly to the point of the position we're in.
Yeah.
We have all of these, we need, in my view, like courageous leaders who aren't looking for conflict for the sake of conflict, but are aren't
afraid of conflict.
Right, but aren't afraid of, and this is the funny thing, because for a long time people would say to me, oh, you're just someone who likes conflict. And I always took that as an insult. And I'm like, I don't think I'm someone who looks for conflict, like you were saying earlier. But then when I was reading this book and some of the resources, they were talking about, like, really the important part about conflict is if you can, instead of the conflict being between us, you externalize it and look at it from, like, here's the conflict, here's the situation. Can I see how you're looking at it? And can I see how I'm looking at it? And can we figure out a way together so that we're working together against the conflict versus the conflict being, and I mean, you already know this, but for I'm sure you do, but for the viewers. And I was like, oh, so like when you're seeking conflict, it's not really about it's not a winning battle between one or the other, which is what so many people understand now about conflict, but more about how can we take it out of our egos and look at it and say, okay, this is us now against the conflict. What can we do together to make that no longer an issue? And for politics, it feels like, speaking generally here, that there's political hit points. There's clips that they want to get, and they pretend that they really want conflict, but they're just getting something for a sizzle reel or something that they can share on social media. But then the actual substance of what they're doing is just posturing. And it doesn't surprise me that I see younger generations feeling more and more disillusioned with politics, because that grittiness, the part of wanting to get into conflict in order to solve something versus to get into conflict to score political points without evidence, misinformation, disinformation. It doesn't surprise me at all that we're here.
No, and I had a conversation. I did a panel this past December with Jason Kenney, and so former Premier of Alberta, and we were talking about oil and gas and the Alberta economy and the Canadian economy, and how the East and the West are pitted against each other and so on. And I said at one point, okay, so we can go on having this conversation about how we have different interests, perhaps, but at what point do we stop talking about the industry and actually have the conversation about how we're going to move to prevent the planet from burning or the country from burning and the flooding? When do we have that conversation? Because if we just stay on the interests of oil and gas in Alberta and the pushback from Eastern Canada, that's all changed since December. I know there's a different conversation going on now, but I think the essence of the question is still important. Well, when do we actually talk about that? Like, how do we solve this problem? Because it's not a conservative problem or a liberal problem or an NDP problem or a Green problem. It is a human problem. And to your point, Margaret, we don't solve problems if we stay on the talking points, because the talking points are about winning a power struggle. They're not about solving a problem. And so that's the challenge that I think we confront as a society right now, if not a world.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Adam, what are you thinking?
I'm mostly just enjoying listening to you guys, and
we could go on all day.
Yeah, I'd be all right with that.
And we have.
Yeah, I mean, it does. It is very different from the way that our political system operates right now. With the talking points, and it's really difficult to get like a local representative, an MPP or something like that, to diverge from the party line.
Yeah, and that's so worrisome. When I hear about politicians who don't even want to take meetings with people who disagree with them. I mean, I remember when I was Minister of Education, and I would regularly meet with groups who knew I wasn't going to agree with them, groups who were looking for funding for private schools, who were looking for all sorts of things that they knew ideologically I wasn't prepared to do, and things that our government didn't stand for and things that I didn't believe in as the minister. But I had a pretty good working relationship with some of those groups because we had conversations, and there would be an increase in understanding. Sometimes we would reach an impasse. I would have conversations, for example, with Catholic bishops about sex ed curriculum, and we didn't have much of a meeting of the minds. And but we did engage in the conversation, and I think that's the job of a politician, quite frankly, is to not just talk to people who agree with you, but to find ways of at least being able to have an interaction with and build a relationship with, because that's the other issue. If we don't have relationships with people who disagree with us, then we're going to be in even more trouble than we are now.
Mm-hmm. I think too, what makes it difficult, and I know you're going to have a lot of, some stories, I'm sure, but that patriarchal view of power over people versus power with or power for people changes those conversations. Because if you go in there as like, I'm the politician and I deserve to be here, I have more power than you, then you're not going to be looking at trying to figure out how to agree with people or how to meet with people, because I have power over you. And I remember in Ford's first government, I met the Minister of Environment, and he said, man, it must be such an honor for you to get to come out of Simcoe County and meet someone like me. And in the back of my head, I was like,
that's amazing.
Wow.
It was amazing. And in the back of my head, I was like, I knew what his riding, how he won it. And I said in my head, I'm like, you're here because 1,000 people decided more to vote for you than someone else. Like, let's not pretend you're ordained by God, right? Even those monarchies have pretty much disappeared. So that idea of like that egoic kind of presentation of I have power over you, I have a higher level of status than you, makes those conversations very difficult. And you see it across political spectrums where that idea of power, entrenched power, deserved power, assumed authority means that I don't have to listen to you. I don't have to meet with you. I don't have to take your questions because I lord over you, versus I'm in this position because I want to have power with you, or I want to have power for people that cannot access that power currently. It changes the whole game of it. You probably had these experiences yourself.
Yeah. Adam, did you want to jump in on that before I say something?
Well, it's just it seems like it's also a structural thing too. So like that's also present in the corporate world, right? And it seems like there's an element of self-selection in a lot of people who vie for positions of leadership, where they want that power over others, right? Because it is that through that hierarchical structure that facilitates that. So then, like, what kind of, I mean, and I think sort of more democratic and grassroots structures seem to attempt to get at this, where that power is more dispersed and collective. But
well, you know what? If I think about early activism for me when my kids were really little and I was serving on church committees, there was a lot of power over going on in those as well. I think that we've organized. I think. Sorry, Mark.
Still is.
Yeah. So I think that we have, as Anglo white Canadians, we've organized our structures in that way. Now we can argue it's patriarchal. I personally think there's an element of that for sure, but it's how we've organized ourselves, and it's very challenging to push up against those and try to change them. Some of us do, some of us didn't feel that, some of us in politics didn't feel that we had power over, but we rather felt that we were answerable to the people who had elected us, because that's the reality. That's who we are answerable to. And have tried to encourage people to get their names on the ballot, because there's no there's no preordained privilege that falls on certain shoulders. I mean, people who are in elected office are just people from the community, and they really are no different than anybody else. And if you forget that, I think, if you're in office, then you end up with the kind of interaction that you had, Margaret. But that problem that runs throughout our society. It was very interesting as a politician who worked a lot with Indigenous people, and I'm not saying that there weren't people in the Indigenous community who wielded power like that as well, but at least within some of the non-Anglo, Franco-Canadian communities, there was some attempt to interact with people in a different way and have a more equitable organization that allowed most or all voices to be heard. Not perfect. There's misogyny in every community. There are exclusions in lots of communities, but at least there are some people in this country and in the world who are trying to find a different way to do it. I'm not sure that that's happening right now in the United States and Canada. I'm not sure that we have people in power who are actually trying to change the way we interact with each other. Certainly in Ontario, in this government, I don't think that is the attempt. But
yeah. Well, I think that's why, this might be controversial for some, but I think that's why we actually need to try to have more representation from marginalized groups, not because they are smarter, not because, we're trying to take away opportunities from people that would normally get them, but because in some weird way, they don't become tainted with the idea that I have power. I have assumed this role, that they know what it feels like to be powerless. They know what it feels like to face struggles that the average person may not see, and that changes. Isn't just exclusive to marginalized communities, but that's more common. That idea of like, I could actually do something that might benefit because I know what it feels like to be on the outskirts of
Right.
our system, right?
Right.
And again,
Yeah.
yeah.
And that's why, that's why, Margaret, just to your point, that is exactly why it's really important that we have women at the table. It's important that we have people of color at the table. It's important that we have disabled people at the table for those exact reasons, that they have not been white, straight men. And so they have not felt that privilege, They know what it's like to be on the outside and not to know where that table of power is. It's very important. And I also think that it is, I always say to young people, I lost my first election, and it's better to lose first. It's important to lose. If you can lose first and you realize that this is a fragile privilege that you are being given, and it can be taken away from you very, very easily. And so the respect that you get, yes, there is positional respect. And I felt that so acutely when I became a minister and then when I became premier. There's a certain amount of respect that goes with the chair, and I could tell when people came in, and people who had no time for me before or after I was in that chair, and they were very interested in sucking up to me, and I was unimpressed, completely unimpressed, because that's not earned respect, that's positional respect, and that it's not real. And so if you get deluded into thinking that people actually respect you because you're there, that's a real danger, because then you're going to make mistakes, right? You have to understand that. I think we have to understand as politicians that we have to earn the respect of the people who walk into our offices and the people who elect us. That's the only way. That's the only way to have a relationship that's going to be sustained over any time.
Mm-hmm.
Do you see opportunities currently, like specifically in Ontario, for in improving that dynamic, like organizations or areas that seem open to working within for that?
So I'm involved with some women, for example, Adam, who are putting on campaign schools over the next few months, trying to help other women to figure out how to run for office and give them some encouragement and some tools to actually do that. So I'm where I have some optimism is that there are numbers of people who want to put their name on a ballot. When you in the run up to an election, I get calls from young people who are thinking about running and want to understand better how that works. That for me is the most optimistic sign that we've got a decent future ahead of us, because there are good people who want to be involved. Now, whether they get elected or not, the process is important, and we need to continue to encourage them. So that's one thing that I am seeing, and that hasn't changed. The conversation has changed a bit with those people, who, if 15 years ago the conversation was about, how do I do the fundraising and how do I build a team? Now the conversation is, how do I help my family withstand the toxicity that they're going to be confronting, as well as how do I do the fundraising and how do I build the team? That's an added layer that I think largely social media, but also just the political discourse. But I still think it's important that we have it. And at the end of those conversations, there are still people who want to run. And that I think is the strength of our democracy. And it's the strength of the society that we've built.
Mm-hmm. I think for us, the thing that's amazing to me is seeing people continue to get up. Do you know what I mean? Continuing to stand up. I remember David Crombie and I said to Adam and I ages ago, we were having an interview with him down in Toronto. And I said, David, what do you do when you have those days when you're just like, I can't anymore. This is too hard. This is too difficult. And he's like, you're not that kind of person. You're just going to get up. So just take your day, take your nap, take your sleep, and then know the next day you're going to get up. And so I think about that a lot when I see people around the community who have faced policy assault after policy assault. People that are fighting for our healthcare, people that are fighting for education, people that are fighting for rights for the unhoused and the poor, that have not had an easy time over these for a long, long time, but in particular these last few years. And yet they still show up. They're still there. They're still caring, and they're still trying to figure out a different way through it. So I think there's this resilience, this grit that still is present regardless of the storm the crap storm we find ourselves in.
Well, and so what, absolutely. And I think about people like Jane Jacobs and John Sewell. John Sewell is one of my mentors early on, and David Crombie. I mean, he's 90 and he's still getting up and fighting, So I think that while it's not our job to my generation, I'm boomer. It's not my job necessarily to run for office now. It is my job to model that resilience and to continue going. So when you, Adam, you talk about organizations, I mean, one of the reasons that I was drawn to the SCGC was that it was a coalition of organizations, all of which were trying in their own communities to do the right thing, gather people, and continue the fight, and those are the kinds of efforts that I think we need to support and lend our energy to.
I like that, because I often get in that rut where, like, especially with climate stuff and environment stuff, it seems like it's 2 steps back for every step forward, and it's been like that for a while. And but considering the counterfactual, like what would we have if we didn't have people who've been fighting for this that whole time? Maybe it's a much darker world.
Yeah. And education, I mean, I think you could make the same argument in education. I mean, I think we keep having the same kind of battles. I remember Jerry Kaplan once, when we were protesting Harris's bills on education, the amalgamations and so on. He introduced me at some event, and he talked about all the protests and the issues I had advocated for that I'd failed at. He's, one of the best failed activists I've ever known. So, I mean, you just keep getting up in the morning, like, what's the option? For me, what is the option? Is the option to just say, well, I've got 6 grandkids and I'm just gonna hang out with them without thinking about what their world is going to be like? I don't know how to do that. And I think that those of us who have that perspective, we need to continue to gather people around us and continue the fight. Otherwise, well, again, what's the alternative, quite frankly?
Have you ever heard that Michael Jordan quote where an interviewer kind of says, for those that don't know, Michael Jordan, arguably the best NBA player ever, basketball player ever, and said to him, Michael Jordan, you're the best player. You've, started listing off all of his stats. And he's like, well, all that career, I've missed X number of shots. 26 times I was called to make the final shot and I didn't. This is the number of games that I lost. This is the number of fouls that, and so it's in sports. A batting average isn't even really like 100. You're never going to get to 100%. So it's like there's all these kind of analogies of, failure seems to be a part of the thing. And I'm not trying to ruin your question, Adam, but
no, that's true.
But in the end, when it comes to personal, you're like, oh my gosh, like I can't believe we fought for that and we lost it. Okay, well, your batting average is pretty average.
Well, yeah. And, I think, so let me just give you a policy example. I think about the basic income policy that we introduced in Ontario. It hadn't been done since the 70s. We brought it in and it was canceled by Doug Ford. But there is a network of basic income activists across the country. There is, there was legislation before the Senate and before the House on basic income. I truly believe that had we not brought that in Ontario, if we did not have the anecdotes from the people who are on the basic income, if we didn't have that base of, even if it's not scientific evidence, it was anecdotal evidence. If we hadn't done that, we wouldn't have moved the bar that little bit forward, and you have to kind of think about, well, how do we move the bar a little bit forward? And I heard a housing person I had listened to a podcast this week on housing, and it was somebody saying if we could just open up the green belt, we'd have lots of land for housing. And I thought, if we had not as a government put that green belt in place, what would we have right now? And how much more sprawl would we have? Yes, I know there are problems. Yes, we've got issues, and there's a lot of work still to be done. And there's obviously too much sprawl and all of that. But we moved the bar a little bit forward by kind of impressing on people how important it is to protect some of the lungs and the source water of the GTA. So, it's a game of inches, this progress thing,
Mm-hmm. Sometimes the most important thing that can happen is keeping an idea alive, right?
Yes, exactly.
Well, that idea part, I think, is also crucial, and it's a bit of a distinction, because ideal, and then the value orientation that you need to have to be able to sort of fight for these things, even because you believe in them, even if they might be difficult and perhaps ultimately not something that can be overcome or achieved. Whereas then and I think this is the orientation that we see increasingly, unfortunately, in some political corners of the world, where there isn't really a value orientation other than money or what I can get for myself, my own, right? Like that. And that's not really a value orientation. It's, money is kind of valueless. If you know what I mean. It's not it's not a value in and of itself.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think I could be more worried about the leadership in the United States than I am right now. I mean, I just cannot believe that Donald Trump is the president of the United States again, and continue to kind of wait for what's the breaking point. At what point will the mass of people who for sure don't believe in him, when will that start to turn the tide? And who knows the answer to that? But again, I think, Adam, it creates more of an imperative for people who do hold a different value system other than just profit to speak up, right? It doesn't make it less important. It makes it more important.
Mm-hmm. Agreed.
So I honestly could continue talking here for quite a while, but we're approaching our hour allotment, and we have 3 questions that we ask our guests every episode. And the first one is, what advice would you give to a young person who wants to make a difference?
What I would say, and what I do say to young people, is, at whatever stage you're at, there are young people in elementary school, for example, who ask me about how did I become premier. And I have to say to them, it never crossed my mind when I was in elementary school that I would be premier, never in a million years. And so I think the answer is, find a thing that you're most engaged in now. Like, what are you interested in? What do you care about? And follow that, because that's what's going to take you to the next step. And at some point, maybe you'll get involved in formal politics, or maybe you won't. But there are lots of ways of being involved and trying to change the world. But you need to look at in your own life, what's the thing you care about, and find a way to be involved in that.
How do you think about failure, and how do you respond when it happens?
Well, we talked a little bit about that, I think.
Yeah, I was trying not to ruin his question, but I kind of did.
Yeah. I mean, I think I'm with David Crombie. You pick yourself up, you get up in the morning and you figure out, what's the thing that I can do today? Or sometimes you have to take a day off, and just give yourself a break. But I think that trying to gather people around you, find yourself in groups of people who are enthusiastic and who give you energy as opposed to sap your energy, and help you to be your best self. I mean, I think that's the best thing that we can do. But the getting up and trying to find those things that feed you enough that you're able to step forward. And, I sound like I'm preaching, and I'm really not. I mean, I struggle with this a lot. I mean, I'm struggling with aging and feeling like, what's my place? What's my right to continue to comment? But as long as there are people asking questions, I think we need to be involved in finding answers. That's how I kind of look at what we're engaged in, what I'm engaged in right now. And I think all of us, to a certain degree, if somebody has got a question and I can help to find an answer, then I think it feels like it's a responsibility to do that.
Can I just add one thing, Kathleen, just to respond to that? Margaret Atwood told me a long time ago that, and she's in her mid 80s now, I think. She said she loved being over 60 because those are the crone years. And the crone years are the year where your now responsibility is to be persnickety and ornery and get involved and don't give a crap about what other people have to say to you. That is your role.
That is true. And I said a number of years ago that I wanted also to reclaim the word crone. It can be sort of wicked old woman, or it can be wise old woman, or at least attentive old woman. And I'm going to go with that.
Is there a male equivalent?
I don't know.
Crone?
I'm not sure.
Grump?
We always assume men are going to be wise, Adam.
Wow.
Women have to strugh to convince the world that they're going to be wise.
And we still have ideas.
Yeah.
There's a book by poet Robert Bly that kind of gets into a little bit of that. It's called Iron John. About the white, and he goes in like a lot of fairy tale stuff that he pulls into it, Grimes and all that, and or Grimm, I don't know, and the white hair and the white beard and all that.
Like the wizard, sort of, yeah.
Okay.
You're a wise young man. You'll be a wise old man, Adam.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
You can get the beard later.
Yeah. Well, in the winter.
Last question.
What's something you've been enjoying? This is more like, something that maybe others could, well, never mind. What's something that you've been enjoying recently? It could be a book, a podcast, a song, an album, activity that you'd like to share with others that they might also like.
Well, there are a bunch of things. I've been reading some of Timothy Snyder's work. He wrote On Tyranny and on Freedom. He's a Yale professor who's now going to be working in Ontario. And I think he has interesting insights on what's going on in the United States and how we need to be thinking about that. I also am reading Ed Broadbent's memoir, Seeking Social Democracy, which is an interesting perspective on Canadian history. And I just listened to a podcast. It's a New York Times podcast. It's a limited series called The Protocol. And it's a very interesting history of the debates around trans people. And I think given the misinformation and disinformation right now, it would be very helpful. I mean, even if it's something that, if it's a subject that makes people uncomfortable, I think having more information rather than less information, it goes right back to the treatments that were developed in the Netherlands decades ago. So it's called The Protocol. Anyway, those are things that I've been looking at. And for laughter, a sister-in-law of mine put me on to Would I Lie to You, which is a British game show that is hilarious. And these two panels try to lie to each other, and somebody has to pick out the lie. It's absolutely hilarious. I can't even remember which streaming.
I've seen it. It is very funny.
It is very funny. So for a laugh.
Oh, I'm gonna have to go look for that podcast, that protocol. That sounds really fascinating.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Margaret, you wanna wrap things up, or give our spiel about people liking the podcast and sharing it?
Well, you just did it, so I don't have to do it anymore. What Adam said: If you like our podcast, then subscribe, share it with others. It's been an absolute pleasure to talk with you, Kathleen. And it's always great to think about power and systems and what people can do inside of it. And I think we all kind of share that idea that relationships are at the foundation of it. So think about the relationships you have and see how you can use those to make everything a little bit easier and better for the people that are in your life now and down the road, right?
Here, here.
Hear, hear. And we'll be on
Thank you,
next.
both of you, for the work that you do. It's
Oh,
very
no worries. No worries. Are we on next week? Yes?
Yes. Next week.
It'll be a surprise.
No, I think it's an academic out of McGill, Ray Tumulty, and his expertise is in 15-minute cities.
Oh, there we go.
I think maybe we can get at some of the myths and conspiracy theories surrounding that.
15-minute cities. All right. Well, that's great. Well, thank you again, Kathleen. Thanks to our listeners, and we hope you enjoyed this conversation. Thanks, Adam.